Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Huffman. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're watching this. So, kind of moving into the back half of this unit, we've got the Constitution finalized. We even got our very first president, George Washington's in office. We got our very first Congress in office. And we already started to talk about some of those divisions between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And again, those Anti-Federalists are going to, this is confusing, I know, going to become uh, Democratic Republicans. The nickname they get kind of is Republicans. So again, when I'm talking about Republicans of this time, I'm not talking about the Republicans of the Civil War and onward. Those Republicans are going to be different. So keep that in mind. I'm not talking about modern day Republicans, okay? But as I said, we've already started to see political parties form, and it's going to get much more divisive, and people are going to get much more divided starting here kind of in the 1790s, okay? One big thing that brings that on and really kind of highlights that divisiveness and that difference of philosophies is going to be the French Revolution. Okay, so that's naturally happening in Europe. You probably remember hearing about it in world history, so I'm not going to go over all the particulars. But again, that was kind of a class war between the bourgeoisie, kind of the wealthy in power, and the more middle class, not even really middle class, but kind of lower classes rising up and kind of taking down the monarchy. Okay. So at first, we're kind of watching it all from overseas. We sympathize with the revolutionaries, right? That, hey, we fought for independence against kind of Great Britain. And even though this is all happening within France, there's not some other foreign power. We're still generally kind of supporting, hey, these people have a point. Maybe changes need to happen. And in general, we're against monarchies, right? We're for democracies or republics where people are properly represented, okay? But more and more news comes back about how brutal and barbaric this whole endeavor is, right? And once we realize, these people aren't just kind of taking things slowly, they're getting much more serious about kind of chopping people's heads off and kind of being very brutal about who they're taking out, then generally Americans, especially those in power, are going to start to turn against the French Revolution. Okay, Federalists, they're going to be very unhappy with the execution of the aristocracy by the radicals. Now, it's not that Federalists were exactly for aristocracy as it existed, but they saw a little bit of themselves in the aristocracy, right? That the Federalists generally were a little bit more wealthy, a little bit more powerful, and they were seeing what was happening in France and saying, this could happen to us here if we're not so careful, okay? So they're very unhappy with the French, and also Federalists, meanwhile, are also kind of becoming more and more pro-British, and that's going to be important to remember. So Federalists a little more pro-British, okay? And at this point in particular, Britain and France had kind of slowed down and weren't in a war with each other, but it was only a matter of time before, once Napoleon takes power in France, that they're going to start that back up again. Republicans, meanwhile, on the opposite end of the spectrum, looked down on the violence. They weren't a fan of these executions that were happening, but they were generally more supportive. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's kind of a famous quote. You'll probably kind of know what I'm talking about. Thomas Jefferson said something to the effect of, the tree of liberty must, on occasion, be refreshed with the blood of patriots. He was actually talking about the French Revolution when he said that, right? That, hey, the aristocrats weren't paying attention to what the people wanted, what the people needed. And so, I'm not crazy about the fact that they rose up in violence, but maybe that's what democracies and republics need, that every once in a while, they need some form of a mini revolution to get the people in power to pay more attention to the lower classes. So again, Federalists, very much against the French Revolution. Republicans, on the other hand, for it, but not super excited about all the violence of it, but in general supported the revolutionaries' ideas, okay? So once that was kind of starting to be a little bit more settled and France declared war against Britain, again, as I said, Federalists more supportive of Britain, Republicans of France, that's going to be a political issue here in America, right? So we're not involved in the French Revolution exactly, and we're not involved in this war that's going to happen between France and Britain, but the political parties are kind of vying for position of how are we going to kind of position ourselves foreign policy-wise to deal with the France or deal with Great Britain. So Federalists, again, generally more supportive of Great Britain and against the French Revolution. Republicans, meanwhile, more pro-France, more pro-French Revolution. Okay, so in the midst of all that, there's going to be a treaty that takes place between the U.S. and Britain that's all about kind of settling the score of some debts that needed to be paid off. And Britain is going to start seizing all neutral ships bound for French ports in particular, including the U.S. So any neutral ships, they're saying, even if they're not involved in this war between France and Great Britain, they're just going to start seizing all ships, which naturally U.S. ships are going to be involved in that. Okay. There's rumors that the British are still in parts of that western U.S. frontier, right? That we thought we had got them all out. There's actually some rumors that they were still out there. And not only that they're encouraging Native Americans to fight back against America and take land from them. Okay. So John Jay, he's kind of our very first Supreme Court, kind of main Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. He's going to be sent over to Britain to try to help settle this situation. And we're going to come to an agreement between us and Great Britain. It's going to be known as Jay's Treaty. Okay, so the U.S. says, all right, Great Britain, you know what? You have the right to seize cargo that is bound for French ports, and we're no longer going to discriminate Great Britain in trade. Okay, Great Britain says, okay, sure, all those items that had been seized, we're going to make sure you get, we'll get that back to you, but there's got to be a third party or an arbitration, which is saying basically that a third party is going to come in and kind of litigate every single little case. Okay. Also, Great Britain says, okay, fine, you win, and they're going to start to give up some of those frontier forts that they actually did still have some British troops over there. Okay, so this is actually good for Great Britain and the U.S. as far as foreign policy-wise. So this is going to start to lower tensions between us. So as you can imagine, Federalists are going to be a lot more happy with this than the Republicans are, right? Because Republicans are more pro-French, means they're anti-British. They don't like that we're kind of cozying up a little bit to Great Britain here. They think we should side more with the French. Meanwhile, the Federalists, they're more happy with this because it's starting to settle the score and lower the temperature between us and Great Britain. Okay, so what's the fallout for this? Well, the treaty's sent to the Senate secretly for ratification. However, Republicans they find out about this. They start to leak it to the public, and Republicans kind of not in office, but kind of your citizens or other kind of talking heads or talking people, newspapers, they're going to be furious, as I said, that, hey, this is too British. We're cozying up too much to the British. We only just beat them in a revolution. Should we, we're on paper, we're neutral, but it seems like we're siding a little more with Britain here. Okay, so there are going to be protests that actually erupt all throughout America. In Washington, again, he's always a moderate voice. He's not going to get too caught up in the kind of anger or fervor of either side. He's going to side it anyways, and this is going to be successful in preventing a war between us and Great Britain. There's also going to be another treaty called Pinckney's Treaty. This is a little later in Washington's term, in 1795, where Spain is going to join France in their war with Great Britain. Okay, again, Spain and France had allied with one another, back in the days of kind of the Revolution or even the French and Indian War, right? So Spain thinks the U.S. and Great Britain are then going to team up to take more land away from them in their kind of new Spanish area, more Native American land. So Thomas Pinckney, similar to Jay in Jay's treaty, he's going to be sent over to negotiate something with Spain, which sets kind of a new dividing line. And it agrees that the U.S. has rights to navigate that Mississippi River, because before that was another thing. That along that Mississippi River, it was hotly contested, where sometimes Americans were having trouble navigating that because Spanish on the other side were kind of, if not right, shooting at them, kind of intimidating them and saying, hey, you don't need to be here. So this is going to say, all right, let's lower the temperature between us and Spain, and let's make it safe for Americans to travel the Mississippi River and even use and deposit goods in the port of New Orleans, which at this time is still controlled by the Spanish. Okay, so this is another successful thing, I would say, by Washington, by kind of lowering the temperature on the other side. So even though France is not actively involved in this, Spain being allied with France also lowers the temperature between us and Spain, and by proxy France. So again, I would say Washington had a very successful presidency for a lot of reasons, one of which he's not going to jump on either side, or either on the British side too harshly or the French or Spanish side too harshly. He's very coolly kind of being the moderate voice, not going to war and jumping into war in the same way that some people on either side are wanting him to do. Okay, so that's all very important. So what about some of that more Western expansion, though, right? So settlers are going to start flocking to some of all that new territory that we had picked up in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, okay, and west of the Appalachian Mountains and kind of closer and closer to the Mississippi River. We get some new territories and what turned into states as a result of that. Kentucky is going to be one of the very first ones. It went from being only a few hundred to 70,000 in less than a decade, less than 10 years. That's a massive jump, right? So a lot of those people, after the war was over, after we had acquired all that land, say, all right, you know what? Let's start moving a little further west. So again, territory that was only a few hundred jumps to 70,000, and Kentucky's going to formally become a state in 1792. As you can imagine, though, there are going to be some inevitable clashes with Native Americans as more and more white Americans are taking on this land. Okay, there's going to be a few battles here, one of which, Battle of Fallen Timbers. That General Mad Anthony Wayne, you might remember me mentioning him in the Revolutionary days, is going to face off against a Native American chieftain known as Little Turtle and an alliance of tribes that Little Turtle had kind of formulated. And the U.S. is going to win and gain some more territory, but there's going to be casualties on both sides of that. Okay, so then there's going to be a new treaty known as the Treaty of Greenville. Okay, this is I know my face is blocking this, so I got my notes over here as well. August of 1795. Okay, that's where 12 Native American nations are going to give up part of southern Ohio and Indiana in exchange for a yearly payment of $10,000 to these groups. Okay, naturally, since we're getting more and more Native Americans out of that Ohio region, there's going to be more and more settlers that show up, and Ohio itself is going to become a state by 1803. So much of that territory, that Ohio River Valley, contested back in the French and Indian War days, still up for grabs kind of in the aftermath of the Revolution. More and more settlers are moving out there, and we already got 2 new states as a result of that, right? So we got Kentucky and Ohio become states in 1792 and 1803, respectively. Okay, so you'll kind of look at the farewell address of George Washington on your own, and there'll be a little assignment for that. Washington makes the massive decision of, you know what, I'm going to step away from the office. I've served 2 terms. He could have been elected over and over again if he really wanted to. But he was a little older. He thought it was a good time to retire. Not only retire for himself and his own health, he thought it was a good idea to step back and let other people take the reins, which I'd say, again, really speaks highly of Washington as a leader, that he was willing to do that. And we couldn't have been blessed with a greater first president than George Washington for all the kind of precedents he began to set. Okay, so his vice president is John Adams. He's going to be elected in 1796 after Washington steps down. And this is really going to be the first openly contested election, because the first 2 elections in 1788 and in 1792, Washington was the hands-down favorite. No one really stood a chance against Washington. Okay, Adams, he had a so-so relationship with Washington. They mostly got along, but at the same time, Adams is going to be a little bit more of a Federalist and be even more willing to kind of give over to Federalist tendencies. Okay, so the Federalists, they're going to support John Adams. Republicans, they support Thomas Jefferson. And Adams is going to win and become our second president. And as this exists, again, Jefferson's going to become the vice president, right? That's still where the second most place votes, they're going to be the vice president, okay, which is going to be a problem, because this is the first time that we have 2 people that really believe kind of Federalist or Republican ideas. Adams is going to go more for the Federalist ideas. Jefferson, certainly the Republican ideas. And this electoral college vote was extremely close. You can see here, 71 to 68. That was incredibly close, right? That's only 3 votes. Very, very close. And only really our second proper election, if you want to think of it that way, already very close, right? So again, this is going to be a lot more problematic than when Adams was Washington's vice president, because like I said, they mostly agreed on a lot of issues. Meanwhile, Jefferson and Adams, they were actually great personal friends, but when it came to policy, they didn't agree on a lot of stuff. They had radically different ideas. So Adams is now president, Jefferson his vice president. As a result of this, France is going to start seizing U.S. ships headed for Great Britain in response to Jay's Treaty. So France is not happy that we signed Jay's Treaty. They see that as, oh, you're acting like you're neutral, but it seems like you're siding more with Britain. We see this as an act of war. So France is going to start seizing U.S. ships. Federalists, naturally, they're pissed off by this, and they say, hey, maybe we do need to go to war with France, right? Meanwhile, Republicans are saying, no, we don't. We need to actually side with the French, right? So Adams himself was a little more pro-British, okay? He saw himself, again, as an American, but also as an extension of the British Empire to some extent. And he had lived some time in both France and Britain. He's going to be pretty critical of France. He doesn't like the way the revolution went. He doesn't like Napoleon. He doesn't like a lot of the French leaders. But more than that, he wants to avoid war at all costs. And so as a result of that, he's going to try to keep us out of the war, even though both sides, Federalists, they want to get in a war. Anti-Federalists want us to, maybe get in the war, but on the French side. And again, Adams is a little more pro-British himself and critical of France, but he still does not want to get in a war at any cost, okay? This is going to lead to a very famous kind of incident, infamous incident, I guess you could say, called the XYZ affair. So the U.S. is going to send some negotiators to go speak with the French to try to lower the temperature, okay? 3 agents are then going to approach our American agents sent by the France's foreign minister, and they're going to basically say, hey, if you want all these problems to go away, we want a bribe of $250,000 just to initiate talks. And again, $250,000 back then, now that's a decent amount now, but back then that was an even more astronomical cost. So just to even talk to the French, you got to pay $250,000. And not only that, you got to give us a $12 million loan because France is kind of in the midst of going to war with Great Britain, which is naturally very expensive. So we don't know exactly the agents' names, but they're going to be referred to as X, Y, and Z. Okay, so naturally there's calls for war against France as a result of this, right? That the French are, I misspelled that. It should be war, like I said. But there's going to naturally be people like, what gives? We're basically being extorted by the French just to even talk to them, and then they want $12 more million. So this is really going to start to get more and more people in America to start turning against the French and start siding with Great Britain, okay? Even Republicans and anti-British people, they're going to start to say, you know what, maybe we should be siding more with the British because of all this nonsense the French are putting us through, okay? So in June of 1798, once this really starts to leak and get out, Congress is just going to say, you know what, we're going to suspend all trade with France totally. And this is going to lead to a term known as a quasi-war. And quasi-war means kind of a semi-war or an almost war. But the thing is, we don't officially go to war with France. Instead, it's more of a kind of a trade war of sorts, right? That we're not sending troops to fight them, but it's more about we're not really kind of helping them trade-wise, and that's certainly hurting them in a lot of ways. Okay, so eventually France and Great Britain are going to agree, the U.S. and France are going to agree to a truce of sorts, and they're going to, the French, that is, start paying back damages for some ships, U.S. ships that they had seized. Okay, so this is a really very big, tough test. I would say the earliest major international test a president really faced, and this is Adams who was president then, right? And I would say more than anything, he passes with flying colors, okay? A lot of people are getting mad at him on one side or the other, but his ability to keep us out of war, again, that was a kind of a policy that he followed from Washington, ultimately served our nation well, even though he's being criticized in the moment, okay? So this is a great victory, I would say, overall by Adams in keeping us out of that war, okay? But one of Adams' greatest failures is actually these acts known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is going to take place in 1798. Okay, so that's passed by all the Federalists who were in power at the time, which include a Federalist Congress and President Adams as well. Now, this is going to be aimed primarily at recent immigrants. And we're going to be talking a lot more about immigration in the coming weeks and months. But for now, these new or recent immigrants are mostly coming from France and Ireland, okay? More than anything, these new groups coming in are going to be anti-British and are going to tend to vote Republican, right? So, again, the Republicans were a little more anti-British, more pro-French. So, France, naturally, they're going to be hostile to Great Britain because of, centuries of nonsense between the two, but also the most recent battles and wars, right? Ireland also, Irish immigrants, I won't go too far into this, but they have a whole history with Great Britain that's very taut and very fraught, okay? So many of these immigrant groups, especially French and Irish, are going to tend to be more anti-British, which means they're going to vote Republican. And so these Alien and Sedition Acts are going to be primarily aimed at them by Federalists who are, again, pro-British and are going to be mostly making up Congress and certainly Adams and kind of the office of the presidency, right? So what did it actually do? It moved the period of citizenship from 5 years to 14 years. Imagine you're a recent immigrant from France or Ireland and you're kind of in year 4. You only have a year left and you're like, okay, once another year passes, I'll be able to be an American citizen. Now, all of a sudden, that's bumped to 14 years, which means now you got to wait an additional 10 years instead of 1 year, right? So it moves the path to citizenship, makes it much more drastic. and that's going to be a problem, right? And so that's kind of the alien part of this, right? Immigrants really pushing back that period of citizenship. But more importantly and more instrumental than that, the idea of sedition, right? Incitement of a rebellion. And people who are critical of the government are now all of a sudden going to start to be targeted. This is going to be especially Republican newspaper editors and politicians who are speaking ill of Adams or speaking ill of the Federalist Congress now have laws against them restricting, frankly, their First Amendment rights, right? Now, we hadn't really had a situation like this before where it seems like the First Amendment was under attack either by the press or just by pure freedom of speech. So this is naturally going to, I'd say, again, one of Adams' greatest failures as president is his passing of this. Now, he wasn't as, advocating on his behalf as much as Federalists in Congress, but he still passed it, he still signed it, he still rubber stamped it. Okay, so again, these Alien and Sedition Acts, what do? Aim primarily at these recent immigrants from France and Ireland who are tended to be anti-British, move the period of citizenship from 5 to 14 years, pretty drastic, and really prevented sedition. You couldn't speak ill of the government in power. Okay, and again, I would say this is a big problem because it's really restricting people's First Amendment privileges. Okay, last little slide here. So that chasm is widening, it seems like, between Republicans and Federalists. Washington, meanwhile, he's kind of out of office and he dies in 1799. So that whole idea that we have a more moderate president who's going to not like this idea of the political parties, that's kind of out the window. Now we have a clear kind of divide between Republicans and Federalists, okay? So Republicans, including Jefferson and even Madison, who I said a while back was a Federalist, but he's going to kind of, again, flip-flop and go to the Republican side. They're naturally, and I would say justly, going to condemn these Alien and Sedition Acts as unconstitutional and restricting people's First Amendment rights, okay? And they also are going to introduce two important concepts. They're going to be very important for the decades to come, including interposition, which is the idea that states could actually protect their citizens from federal laws. So again, they're saying, well, if the federal government's not going to protect people's rights, maybe if we're interposing and the states jump in, that's going to protect people's rights as citizens, right? And then the idea, similar to that, of nullification, that there could be a federal law passed and the states then jump in and say, you know what, this law is invalid, this law isn't just, okay? Now, these are not going to get a lot of influence and a lot of headway in the late 1790s, right? But this whole idea that the states are going to take a more active role, and if they don't like what the federal government's doing, that they're going to jump in and do their own thing. These are kind of important seeds to remember when we get to talking about the Civil War in the coming decades, okay? So again, they had little effect, but it's going to start to assert these ideas that I've already been speaking of. Federalists, they want a large federal government. Republicans, on the other hand, they think states and local governments should have more control. And this whole battle between Washington and Adams and Jefferson is going to really play itself out, and I'll talk about tomorrow, and the very fraught and very controversial election of 1800, which Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton also play a role in. Okay, so that's going to do it for today. If you have any questions for me, as always, please reach out and ask, and I'll be happy to answer them. Take care. God bless.